Yeah, you can hear me now. Okay. We will begin this morning, as usual, with the beginning prayers of refuge and bodhicitta. So just one moment while I get that up. O sangye chedan tsoge chonam la chancho pardo dane chapsum che dage chenyen gibe sanam je rola penjer sanje robar sho Sangye chedan tsoge chonam la chancho pardo dane chapsum che dake chenyen gibe sanam gi drola penjer sanje robar sho sangye chedan tsoge chonam la jancho bardo dane chapsum che dage chenyen gibe sanam gi rola penjer sanje robar sho until enlightenment I go for refuge to the Buddha, Dharma, and the sublime Sangha. By the merit of my listening to the Dharma, may I reach Buddhahood to benefit beings. Semjen tamje dewa dan dewe judan dembrar jurji donga dan donga gi judan rawa jurji donga mebe dewa tamba tam min rawa jurji Nirin chadan nidan rawa tanyong chembola nebra jurji. May all sentient beings be happy and have the causes of happiness. May they be free of suffering and the causes of suffering. May they never be parted from the highest joy, which is free of suffering. May they dwell in the great equanimity, free of attachment or hatred for those near or far. Now think to yourself that we must bring all of our mothers, all sentient beings throughout space to the state of completely perfect Buddhahood. And in order to do this, we need to meditate. In order to meditate, we need to have some understanding first to make sure that we can meditate properly. And so think to yourself that this is the reason why we are engaging in study of the Dharma today. The Dharma that we are studying is the Treasury of Abhidharma by Vasubandhu, as commented on by the 9th Karmapa Wangchuk Dorje in his commentary, Youthful Play. Of the 8 chapters of the Treasury of Abhidharma, we are discussing the 5th, the Teachings on the Kernels. The Teachings on the Kernels has 3 main sections, the first being the nature of the kernels, the second is what discards the kernels, and the third is the results of discarding the kernels. So this morning, we will complete the first of these, the nature of the kernels, and then move on to the second, the discards of the kernels, and possibly even begin the third. So that is the plan for this morning. But in the nature of the kernels, there are the 2 topics, the teaching that the kernels are the root of existence, and understanding the kernels. And the second, understanding the kernels, has 3 topics. Again, the classifications of the kernels, how the kernels arise, and the enumerations, or the different ways of describing the different words and sort of ways of grouping the kernels. That is the section that we are in now. And in that, there are the points according to the treatises and the points according to the sutra. There's the actual enumerations and what the kernels are concurrent with in teaching the 5 obscurations. So we have come to the point where we are talking about the 5 obscurations. Now, before we begin with that, however, I did have a question that came in over the internet last night or yesterday afternoon. This question has to do with, it's sort of tangential to the point that we were speaking about yesterday, which afflictions are concurrent with which feelings. So when we talk about feelings, in general, there are three. There's pleasure, pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral feelings in general. Now, the Sanskrit words for these are sukha, dukkha, and vyakrita, I think the third. I'm not certain, I can't remember the last one certainly, but the happy or pleasure is sukha, suffering is dukkha. Those two I'm quite certain about. So with the dukkha, Wangchuk Dorji used the word in the text, and then someone sent a question about the word. Because we always translate the word, we usually translate the word dukkha as meaning, as suffering. That's the most common translation for it. In the context of talking about the feelings, if you say a feeling of you could say happiness and suffering, and you could say that, but it's not quite idiomatic in English. So it's common in English to talk about the feelings as being pleasant for sukha and unpleasant for dukkha. But the questioner was asking actually about the meaning of the word dukkha itself, because it's often said that the meaning of dukkha is that it's unsatisfactoriness. And so wouldn't that be, is that an appropriate translation for the word? So, and this is something that you read a lot, especially in teachings from the Pali tradition. I've seen it much more in teachings from Theravada Buddhism than I have from Tibetan Buddhism. And the reason for this is that in the Pali language, they describe the etymology of the word dukkha, which is essentially a slightly simplified pronunciation of the Sanskrit dukkha. It's the same word, essentially. So they explain it as meaning the sound that a wheel or an axle makes as it creaks on as the axle makes as it creaks on a cart. It's like, so it's that kind of uncomfortable sound. That's the sound, and so that sound is what the word dukkha comes from, they say. And so therefore, when we talk about dukkha, then that means it's kind of that discomfort, that subtle level of discomfort, the unsatisfactoriness of life. That's the fact that it's always kind of creaking. It's never moving too smoothly. You have to remember that 2,600 years ago, they didn't have ball bearings. So wheels would creak and make that sort of horrid sound. So that's what the word means. So now the question is this a good translation for the word? And so the point here, you have to look at a couple of things. You look at when you want to know what a word is in your own language, you have to look at the etymology or the kind of literal meaning of the word in the source language. And you also have to use it. What is it used for? So when you talk about suffering, in particular as presented in the Tibetan tradition, I'm not, or I can only really I can speak best about the Tibetan tradition, which includes the Sanskrit tradition. When they talk about dukkha, what do they talk about? The greatest examples they give are the examples of being boiled alive in molten copper in the hells, stabbed, getting sick, dying. We talk about the four great rivers of suffering. We've got birth, which is just painful for both the mother and child. You've got illness, which is just suffering. It's not necessarily painful, but it's just suffering. You've got aging, which as we get older ourselves and as we watch our parents get older, you can really see how much suffering aging actually is. And then death, which is a lot of suffering. So are you going to talk about, okay, yeah, you're being boiled in a pot of molten copper in the hells. Is that unsatisfactory or is it suffering? So what we mean, the point here is that the word dukkha applies for everything from really subtle suffering that we don't even realize, the pervasive suffering of formation, everything up from there to absolute unbearable agony. So it's that whole gamut. That's what the word refers to. And so when you're picking it, you have to kind of think about this. So I think one of the reasons why in the old scriptures they talk about suffering as being also just being unsatisfactoriness, not just out and out pain. It's because when they heard the word dukkha at the time of the Buddha, they just thought suffering, pain. And when you say, hey, but its etymology is this, and it actually also means unsatisfactoriness, what that does is it tells us, hey, that it's the whole gamut. It's everything. And what we're trying to eliminate is not just the gross suffering, but also the subtle suffering. As the Dalai Lama says, the suffering that we really need to eliminate is the pervasive suffering of formation, which is the suffering that is so subtle that we ordinary beings don't even realize it. So that's, I think, the point of saying that it is unsatisfactory. That's my interpretation of it, because the semantic range is huge. In the present day, when we see teachings saying that the word dukkha means unsatisfactoriness, this is in the context of teachings given for people in kind of a secular Buddhist context where they're not talking about eliminating all the gross. They're certainly not talking about the sufferings of the hells. They're not really talking about avoiding the sufferings of birth, aging, sickness, and death. They're talking in the context of let's reduce stress in this lifetime. And then say, hey, dukkha means unsatisfactoriness. And then everyone can relate to it because it's like, oh yeah, we want to get rid of stress. Our lives in a modern society are not all that stressful, are not all that painful compared to what they were even 100 years ago. And so, or even 50 years ago, really. When you look at our lives are just there's not a whole lot of suffering in them. And so people don't relate to it. And also when you have Westerners who come in and who don't have an idea of past and future lives, the idea that you can meditate and then avoid all the pain of birth and dying, they just don't get it. And so you say unsatisfactoriness, and they can understand it on a certain level, but what happens is that our meditation then becomes worldly. We're no longer thinking about trying to get liberation from suffering, from all levels of suffering, everything from the pervasive to the extreme sufferings of the hells. So that's an important point. So we have to eliminate our suffering. How do we eliminate our suffering? We eliminate our suffering by eliminating the causes. What are the causes? Well, it's the actions, our defiled actions that create the sufferings of samsara. In particular, our negative actions, our misdeeds, create the suffering of suffering, the actual painful aspects of samsara. What do those come out? They come out of the afflictions, which come out of the kernels, which is why we speak about this now. So the reason why we're teaching the kernels is because if we uproot the kernels, then we will interrupt the cycle of taking birth, right? No kernels means no taking rebirth, because karma leads to rebirth only if they're kernels, only if they're the afflictions. So you eliminate the afflictions, the karma is pretty much purified because it just can't do anything, and you will not take rebirth. And then you are free from not only the gross sufferings of birth, age, sickness, and death, and being boiled in copper pots, or pots of molten copper in the hells. You are also freed of the subtler levels of dissatisfaction, or the very subtle level of suffering of formation. So that's the reason why it's good to keep a kind of broader idea of what the word dukkha actually means. Everything. Anything from just mildly unpleasant to excruciatingly painful, that whole range is covered by dukkha. And that's also why it's important for us to study this chapter. So in the chapter, we've talked a lot about the different kernels. We've talked about the different classifications of the kernels. And then you want to know, well, what are we going to do to get rid of the kernels? Well, we do meditation in order to eliminate them, to abandon them. Eliminate, abandon, and discard are basically saying the same things, to get rid of them. And how do we do that? Well, we need to do meditation, but the kernels themselves are blocks to meditations. And in particular, there are several kernels that are blocks to meditation. And where did it go? I'm sorry, I didn't prepare myself quite as well this morning because we had a puja until just about 5 minutes before the class started. So here we are. So we're talking about the 5 obscurations that are taught in the sutras. So here it says at the bottom of this screen, or if you are in the book, it is on the top of page 423. So teaching the 5 obscurations. There we go. So teaching the 5 obscurations. This has 2 topics, their essences and establishing their quantity. So their essences, the first one, and it's just one single line. The obscurations are in desire. So the 5 obscurations are afflictions or near afflictions that prevent us from developing meditation. And they are in the desire realm. The reason why they're in the desire realm is because when you're in the form realm, you're already able to really do stable meditation. So you don't have the same obscurations. These are the things that in the desire realm, like when you sit down and you start to meditate, like you go off to retreat and you sit down to meditate and you're in this isolated place, there's nothing outside of you preventing you from meditating, but there are things inside of you that you just can't settle down. So what are they? They are the 5 obscurations. So here they are. It says in a sutra, pleasure-seeking, malice, torpor and sleep, excitement and regret, and doubt are the 5 obscurations. So these are the ones that are taught. Now we've got 7 things that are listed here, don't we? Pleasure-seeking, malice, torpor, sleep, excitement, regret, and doubt. That's 7. Well, they're 5 because you group torpor and sleep together, and you group excitement and regret together. And if you put those 2 together, you combine 4 into 2, then you've got 5, right? So torpor and sleep go together, excitement and regret go together. So of these that are taught, it says in the commentary, torpor, excitement, and doubt are in all 3 realms, right? Pleasure seeking and malice are only in the desire realm, but those torpor, excitement, and doubt are in all 3 realms. So are those of all 3 realms obscurations or just those of desire, you ask? And so the answer is, it is the latter. And the reason why is because the Buddha said this in a sutra. So it says from a sutra. These are an unmixed, complete, and total heap of non-virtue. They are thus the 5 obscurations. So here the Buddha says they are non-virtue. So this means that we're talking about, some of these can be neutral, right? But we're talking about the unvirtuous aspects, and the unvirtuous aspects are only in the desire realm. So this says they are solely non-virtue. Therefore, the obscurations of the dhyanas and absorptions are in desire, but not in the other realms. And then the other logic is just sort of thinking about it. When you're other realms, you've got stable meditation. The dhyanas are really stable meditation. So you're beyond those obscurations. So establishing their quantities, like we talked about, there are 7 factors, but they're grouped as 5 obscurations. So why is that? That's establishing their quantity, and there are 2 points. And so the reason that this is not contradictory with the explanation of them as 7. So we have the 7 qualities, that's not contradictory being 5. And the reason is their incompatibilities and nourishment and action are the same. So therefore 2 are 1. So you've got the 2 of torpor and sleep, and then the 2 of excitement and regret. Torpor and sleep have the same thing that's incompatible with them. So the same antidotes. That's the incompatibilities, means the antidotes to them. And the nourishment is kind of the opposite of this, what makes them increase. Those are the same. And their action, or you could say their function, is the same. The way they disturb you and prevent you from, or the way they prevent you from achieving meditation is the same. So therefore, torpor and sleep, the antidote for the 2 is the same. They are nourished by the same, and their function is the same, making you too dull to meditate. And so therefore, they're counted as 1. Likewise, excitement and regret. They have the same antidote, the nourishment, that which makes them increase, and their action are the same. So therefore, excitement and regret are 1. So therefore, 2 are 1. Okay. So why, it says in the commentary, why are both torpor and sleep and both excitement and regret taught as 1 obscuration each, even though they are separate mental factors? So why do we have teach 5 instead of 7? Well, the reason is because they're incompatible antidotes. So the antidotes are what eliminates them, and the cause or nourishment and the karmic action are the same. So therefore, both sets of 2 are made into 1. So the antidote for both torpor and sleep is the conception of light. For example, When you start, like we have the instructions that come down in our Kaji lineage that many of you who've had teachings from Trungpa Rinpoche and other Kaji masters say, when you start feeling dull, and what do? You open up the windows, you take off layers of clothes, you let cool air and so forth. It's the light. Also, the idea of light helps you. The conception of light helps you eliminate torpor and sleep. So the antidote for those two is the same. And their nourishment is lethargy. And then displeasure, just not feeling, and yawning. The heaviness of undigested food and depression, just kind of being kind of like, oh, So it's all these things that bring you down. And their action is to depress or to depress the mind. So both of them do the same. Because what happens when you get torpid is like torpor is kind of just dullness. You're just getting dull. And then sleep is when you're actually kind of nodding off in sleep, right? So that's the difference. Torpor is just really essentially just dullness, and sleep is when you're actually kind of going into the sleep. And they both have the same thing. Like in the instructions that we get from the Kaji tradition, if you start feeling dullness and torpor, especially habitually, what do? Eat light food. Don't eat heavy food. If you go and you eat rich food with lots of butter and potatoes in large quantities and other things, and you're just sitting there going, oh, then you're going to automatically be dull. But if you're eating light food, so all you Europeans who like salad, you eat lots of salad, fresh vegetables, and that kind of keeps you fresher, right? So with the antidote for both excitement and regret is tranquility. So excitement here means like thinking about games. Actually, this is kind of comfortable. I'll talk about that later. So excitement or agitation, when you just can't come down, your mind is going too fast. And regret is when I shouldn't have done that. When you're thinking, I shouldn't have done something. So the antidote for both of these, it says here tranquility. And since the time I did this translation, I started just saying shamatha meditation. The antidote is shamatha meditation. You have to learn how to do good shamatha meditation. If you can do that, that acts as an antidote for excitement and regret. Their nourishment is thoughts of those dear to you, thoughts of your homeland, thoughts of immortality, and remembering exciting games and so forth from the past. And so forth also includes remembering your love life. So when you start thinking about that, that is agitation. So the action is to distract the mind. So the antidotes traditionally given for this have got to be like when you're feeling torpor and sleep, you turn on, you open up the windows, you turn on the lights, you get air going. Well, the opposite for agitation and regret is to kind of make the room darker, a little bit warmer, put on an extra layer of clothes, and to eat that heavier food. Don't eat light food when you're having excitement and regret. And no miso soup and things like that. You want to have that good, heavy Tibetan food. You want to have that, what is it? The basa marco, which is kind of like the Tibetan version of gnocchi, Italian gnocchi. It's like little balls of dough and butter with a little bit of sugar and some yogurt, and it's very, very heavy. So something like that. That's going to really bring you down. Okay? So the action. So these are the 5 distractions. And so now the reason they are established as 5 is because they have different functions. So because pleasure seeking and malice, harm the aggregate of discipline. So here we're talking about aggregates, but we're not talking about the 5 aggregates of form, feeling, conception, formation, and so forth. We're talking about the undefiled aggregates of discipline, samadhi, and prajna, as well as discipline of wisdom and what's the last one? Last one is yishi. It's slipping out of my mind. This is the problem when you go straight from puja without reminding yourself of these things right before class. At any rate, there are these 5 pure aggregates. So pleasure seeking and malice harm the aggregate of discipline, because when you're feeling pleasure seeking, then you want to act out of greed, which goes against your discipline. When you're feeling malice, you want to act out of anger, which harms discipline. Torpor and sleep harm the aggregate of full knowing. That is the aggregate of prajna, because your mind gets really dull. And when your mind is dull, you just don't have that capacity of discernment that you can distinguish what is dharma and for what is not dharma. That's what full knowing here is an old translation. It should probably be prajna. And excitement and regret harm the aggregate of samadhi. So the aggregate of samadhi is your ability to meditate. And because without samadhi and prajna, or full knowing, one will have doubts about the truth. So therefore, it is explained that they're just these 5 obscurations. So here we're talking primarily about the aggregates of discipline, samadhi, and prajna. And so these 5 obscurations harm those. So that completes the first major section of this chapter, the nature of the kernels. And so now we have come to the second major topic, what discards the kernels. Because we know what the kernels are. We know that there's just a complete source of pain and suffering, maybe mild pain in this lifetime, but horrendous pain in future lifetimes. So we need to get rid of them. So how do you get rid of them? So there are 5 topics here. How they're discarded. That means how you get rid of them or abandon them. Classifications of the antidotes that discard them. What they are divided from and discarded. Because like they're part of the mind. So how do you divide them from the mind? How do you separate them from the mind? What distances one from what has been discarded? So how do you get further away? And teaching that the abandonment is attained over and over again. So the first point is how they are discarded. So how do you discard the afflictions? Well, you discard the afflictions at 2 stages. You discard them on the path of seeing and on the path of meditation, right? So we have the discards of seeing and the discards of meditation. And the way that these 2 paths work is different. So therefore, they're described differently. So here it says, first it describes how discards of seeing are abandoned. So the root says, by knowing the focus perfectly, extinguishing what focuses on that and discarding the focus. So knowing the focus perfectly. In other words, you are looking at what the afflictions would observe and you see it perfectly. The afflictions look at the 5 aggregates and they think of it as a self. Personality view in particular does that, right? And you look at the 5 aggregates and see there's no self. You know it perfectly. Or extinguishing what focuses on that, the afflicted subjects that focus on that, what is seen, and then by discarding the focus. So there are 3 ways that discards of seeing are abandoned. They are discarded by knowing the focus perfectly, by extinguishing the afflicted subject that focuses on that, and by discarding the focus. So the first method discards the first 2 classes, discards of seeing suffering and origin of all 3 realms. So you've got this is what happens when you when you first see suffering in the realm of desire, you see the nature of what you were mistakenly viewing and reacting to with desire, anger, and so forth, right? And so you're knowing that focus perfectly. You're knowing it completely. And then you see the same for the upper realms, and you know the same for the upper 2 realms. And so that discards like your anger and desire and so forth of the 3 realms, with the exception of the 9 universals that focus on higher realms, or 38 kernels. So you are taking a look at the discards of seeing. So the 9 universals are like the personality, not the personality view and wrong view. You've got the doubt, ignorance. I looked at it last night, and now that I'm looking at it this morning, it's slipping my mind. I'm sorry. The 9 universals are described earlier. So the views and doubts that you discard by seeing suffering, with the exception of the personality view and the wrong view. So your personality view and extreme view. So you have your wrong views, your view of overesteeming the path and overesteeming discipline and austerity, as well as the ignorance and ignorance, both simultaneous and unmixed. So you've got those. Those are not discarded by seeing the focus, because you're not seeing the whole thing right away. So in other words, it focuses on all the rest of the 38 kernels of the desire realm and the form and formless realms, of the first two truths. So it also discards the 12 types of wrong view and doubt of the three realms discarded by seeing cessation and path. So when you see cessation and path, you might have wrong views or doubt of the three realms that are discarded by seeing cessation and path. Those are discarded by seeing the nature of the path, cessation and path exactly. So those are discarded by knowing the focus perfectly. In addition, it discards the portions of the 6 ignorances from those two classes that focuses on the undefiled, and the portion of the 9 universals of desire that focuses on its own level. So you've got so in other words, when it's looking at the things that it can actually see on its own, the things that the kernels can focus on, then those are discarded by knowing the focus perfectly. Just as knowing that something is a scarecrow blocks the perception of it as a human, these kernels are discarded by simply seeing the actual characteristics of the 4 truths. So once you see that everything compound is suffering, impermanent, selfless, and empty, then you're no longer going to have any idea about it being clean, permanent, a self, and pleasurable, right? Those just are gone. And then the second method of discarding the universals is the extinguishing what focuses on that. Let me go back to show you that. So extinguishing what focuses on that. This is the second method. So extinguishing what focuses on that second method. So that here refers to to what you are knowing, again, the natures of the truths. So the second method discards the portion of the 9 universals of desire that focus on the higher realms. So even though one does not know the truths of the higher realms, when the subject that focuses on those truths, the universals of the same status as kernel's own levels, is extinguished, they are blocked. So when you are in the desire realm and you look and you haven't known the higher realms yet, instead you don't see them directly, so you can't. So just knowing the focus doesn't quite work when you're still on the level of desire, when you haven't known the suffering of the higher realms yet. But at that point, you have eliminated those kernels that focus on that desire. So when you eliminate those kernels, then that subject, or you're eliminating the consciousness of the desire realm that looks on those. So then the afflicted consciousness that looks at those, and so that means that the kernels of the same status of their own level is extinguished, and therefore they are blocked, because there's no longer any condition for them to focus on that would focus on that. And the third method discards all 23 discards of seeing, cessation, and path that focus solely on the defiled, and the portion of their 6 ignorances that focus on the defiled. So when they're focused, the subjects of the undefiled are discarded. They have no object, so they do not arise. So these are discards of suffering, of seeing, cessation, and path. If you recall, we mentioned this, and it's kind of a subtle point. There's been a lot. But when you talk about the discards of seeing, suffering, and the cessation and path, there are some that directly see cessation and path, and then there are some that kind of look at misconceptions of it. So those ones that look at the misconceptions, they don't see the truth. Instead, when the misconceptions of the truths are eliminated, the mistaken engagements of the mistaken engagement, as it's called in the texts, when those are eliminated, then those afflictions that are those mistaken engagements then are eliminated. So in other words, when you have your doubt that's looking at when you have desire that's looking at the truth of cessation, that desire focuses directly on it. So when you see the truth of cessation and see that it is peace, resplendent, and cessation, then at that point, that desire can't function. It's eliminated. You've known the focus perfectly, so that's eliminated then. But when you have doubt, doubt isn't actually seeing. The doubt that of the truth of cessation doesn't actually look at the truth of cessation itself. It looks at some sort of a misconception of it. And so when that misconception goes away, then the doubt also goes away. That's what it's saying. So these are three ways that they happen in the truth of seeing. So if you want to think about this in a simple way, what you say is that when you see the nature of the truths, all of the kernels that know those truths or that kind of use, that focus on misunderstandings of those truths are all then also eliminated, right? Just by knowing the truth. For example, the example of seeing a scarecrow that blocks the perception of it as human, when you see a scarecrow from far away and you think it's a person and you're angry at that person, then you've got the anger, and then then at the moment that you get close enough to see that it's a scarecrow and not the person, then your anger also goes away. So it's similar here. When you see the four noble truths, and you see them in order, then it eliminates all the afflictions that would focus on them, to put it simply. And there are kind of three different ways if you're dividing it finely. So as Wangchuk Dorje says in the last paragraph here, these three methods of discarding happen at the same time with separate isolates. In other words, it's kind of like a conceptual distinction, it's saying. There is no order of earlier or later. This is just because of the different way these kernels engage engage their objects. That's the only reason that there's different ways of happening, but they all happen at the same time. So the main thing to remember on the beginning level is that what you do is you see the nature of the truth, and that eliminates the kernels. If you want to get into the specifics of how it eliminates the kernels, then this is describing the specifics. So that is the section on the discards of seeing. And the second section is the discards of meditation, how discards of meditation are abandoned. And this says, extinguished by the ante's birth, or when the antidote arises, then the discards of meditation are eliminated. So for example, you've got, it's like when you have when you have anger at something, like here's the example of the anger at the scarecrow that you think is when you have anger at a person. The scarecrow is not so good. If you have anger at a person, when you achieve the wisdom that realizes that your anger is inappropriate, then the anger naturally goes away. When you realize the basis of the anger is when you have the wisdom that realizes that it's the nature of it, then the kernel cannot function. So this is primarily talking about the meditation, or this is talking about the discards of meditation. The discards of meditation in one's own being are extinguished not by completely knowing the focus and so forth. Rather, the 9 lesser, medium, and so forth discards are extinguished by the 9 lesser, medium, and so forth antidotes birth. So when you have, remember we talked about this the other day, we had the greater of greater, the middling of greater, and the lesser greater, and the middling, greater middling, middling, and the lesser middling, then the greater, lesser, middling, lesser, and the lesser, and afflictions, right? Have the 9 sets of afflictions for each of the levels of samsara, the desire realm, and the levels of form and formless. So for each of those, you have 9 sets of afflictions. And the way you eliminate them is by developing wisdom. So when you develop that wisdom, or the antidote, at first you have a small wisdom arise, and it eliminates the greater of greater discards. Then you have a slightly larger bit of wisdom arise, and it distinguishes the middling greater, and so forth, until you have stronger and stronger antidotes that are eliminating weaker and weaker afflictions until you have discarded all of them for that level, right? And so they're divided into 9 sets. 9 sets of discards and 9 sets of antidotes. The discards go from greater of greater down to the lesser of lesser. The antidotes go from lesser of lesser to greater of greater, but they they go they function in that way. So we'll describe that more in the next chapter. The greater of greater and lesser of lesser is something we'll think about later. You can just kind of file that now. But the main point is that when the antidote arises, then that severs the attainment of the essence of the kernel. So the kernels are discarded by severing the attainment of the essence. So when you no longer have, so that means eliminating the attainment of the essence of the kernel. When you've discarded that, that means that, or when you have severed that attainment, stopped it from continuing, then the kernels have been discarded. So remember, here we're talking about attainment as being a separate, in the great exposition, they say that attainment is a separate thing than the kernel itself. You eliminate the attainment, you no longer have the kernel in the present, but you do have the past and so forth still. So it's severing the attainment. Those and others beings are discarded through becoming free of the desire of interest, because one does not have the attainment of them, and because when the afflictions in one's own beings have been discarded through the severing the attainment, they, that is the kernels in other beings, will also be abandoned. So here what they're saying is saying abandoning the kernels in other beings doesn't mean that you see them and the other person is then, you achieve enlightenment and the other person achieves enlightenment. That's not what it means. It means that those kernels in the other being basically can't affect you anymore. You've abandoned them, they don't affect you. So when you develop the antidote, your own afflictions, your own kernels are eliminated. When you look at the kernels in other sentient beings, it doesn't eliminate their kernels. But on the other hand, because you've seen the nature of them, then you no longer have such interest in them. They're not going to get your goat in the same way. In other words, they're not going to disturb you. They're not going to be a problem for you. Now, you may feel compassion for the other person, but you're not going to be as riled up by it. It's a different thing. Rather than having a incorrect way of looking at it, you'll be seeing it more with wisdom, right? So this is basically speaking about that process. Now, the important point here now is the next one, the classifications of the antidotes that discard, because there's kind of a progression about how the antidotes actually do it. It's not like it's just wisdom arises in a single instant. There's a process. You work at it, the wisdom arises, and then you're freed, and then you're distanced, and then you kind of move further away. So there are 4 types of antidotes. There are the discarding, base, and distancing, and disgust, so-called. So these are what they're called. They're not the actual names. They have different names that they're given, but this is what it's called here, kind of upon their function. So there are 4 types of antidotes. The first is the discarding antidote, which is the path of no obstacles. And so the path of no obstacles we'll talk about quite a bit in the next chapter. It's like the first moment that the wisdom arises. So you've got your kernel right here. And then the moment that wisdom arises, those two are together. But this path, it has no obstacles. It's uninterrupted. It can't be stopped. And when it comes up, it's going to continue. And so then the discard goes away. You're only left with wisdom, right? So that's the path of no obstacles. Then the base antidote, this is the path of liberation that consolidates the antidote. Now, this is one, the translator of the Chim Abhidharma, Ian Coughlin, translated it as the maintaining antidote, which I think is an interesting term, and I'm going to consider it when I go through and revise this text. But the point is that the path of liberation is after the moment, you've got the first moment is when you've got the wisdom and the antidote together, but the antidote is dying. And then the second moment is when you have the path of liberation. You are liberated. You are free. It's that first moment. That's kind of like consolidating the abandonment. It's like making it solid. And then the next moment is the distancing attitude, which is the distinctive path, which means every moment from that second moment on gets you further and further away from what has been discarded. And then the last one is the antidote of disgust, so-called, which is any path that sees a realm as deficient and creates disgust. So what this means is that you realize it's disgust with samsara, disgust with the desire realm in the beginning, and saying, I don't want to be here, I'm going to meditate. And so this is what we call the path of preparation. So you've got four levels of the antidote. First, you have the preparation, which is kind of meditating and trying to develop the wisdom, such as you try in meditation. And that's the path of joining, or the antidote of disgust. Then you have, and so you have the affliction here. The affliction is still here and you're meditating on it. It's getting a little weaker, but it's not leaving. And then you have that moment where all of a sudden that wisdom, that path of no obstacles that discards it, arises. And the two are present at the same moment, but this is so weak, it can't do anything. It just goes away and you only have your wisdom left. And then that wisdom in the next moment is the path of the path of liberation. That path of liberation is kind of like consolidating. It's like, wow, I'm free. And then the next moment, it's like you're getting further and further away from that. That's a distinctive path that distances you from it. So those are the four levels of the antidotes, or the four paths: the path of joining or training, the path of no obstacles, the path of liberation, and the path of the distinctive path. Those are the four paths. And you feel disgust, then you discard the antidote, then you have like the basis, or you maintain it, and then you distance yourself. So those are the four antidotes. So now the next question is what they are divided from and discarded. That means, what are the kernels divided from and discarded? Because you're getting rid of them from your being. So how do you get rid of them? How does that work? So the afflictions are discarded through their focus, it's said. So when the afflictions are discarded, what are they proposed to be discarded through? How can they be discarded? Like, are you taking them are you like taking that mental factor and removing it from the group of mental factors? Or are you doing it some other way? They cannot be divided from the concurrences because they cannot be detached from their own group. Like, we have several groups of mental factors that work together, as is described in chapter 2. So those of you who have studied chapter 2 already, remember you've got the afflicted major ground, you've got the non-virtuous major ground, you've got the ground of the near afflictions, and all of those, when you have one of those, you have all of them. They work in groups. You can't decide, well, I'm going to just eliminate a lack of conscience, but not eliminate brazenness. Those two go together. You have to eliminate them both together, right? So you can't separate them from the group. Instead, the afflictions are to be discarded through their focus, it is said, because if the focus is discarded, they cannot arise through a focus on it. Oops, excuse me, I didn't mean to do that yet. So when you talk about discarding through the focus, what we're talking about is like when you are, when you're focusing on the things of the realm of desire, like the meditation, the realms of the realm of desire, well, those are things that focus on like sensory objects and so forth, things that are considered real phenomena in the Great Exposition School. And so when you abandon those, which doesn't mean destroying them, but basically destroying all of your interest in them, then the afflictions that would focus on them go away. For example, you have your perfect example of a meditation discard is chocolate, oblivion, truffle, tort. That's a discard of meditation, right? Now, discarding chocolate, oblivion, truffle, tort doesn't mean throwing it in the rubbish bin. Discarding it means developing the wisdom that sees that like attachment to it is bad, as feeling disgust for it, realizing that this is keeping me stuck in samsara because I'm still thinking about it 25 years after I last made it, right? And the more I talk about it, the more I want to have it again, which is even worse. So what do we have to do with the chocolate, oblivion, truffle, tort? We have to overcome the attachment to this realm that then means that we're just no longer, it's kind of like putting hay in front of a dog. A dog is not going to eat the hay. They don't care about it. You put hay in front of a tiger, no interest, right? So if you can feel about that chocolate, oblivion, truffle, tort in the same way, then the afflictions are not going to arise towards it. So we develop the freedom of attachment from the realm. And by developing that freedom from attachment, then we are freed of all of the other discards that keep us attached to that realm. So it's through the focus on that. So you discard what you are focusing on. Because if we remember from the very first chapter, actually we talk about how actually all of the objects of sense and so forth are also meditation of discards, or discards of meditation. Okay, so there you've discarded things. We've talked about the discarding. We've talked about the different ways you see them you discard them on the path of seeing and meditation. Now we've talked about what they're divided from. In other words, how you get rid of the afflictions in your being. So now what we're talking about is what distances one from what has been discarded. So once I have freed myself from the desire realm and no longer have any attachment to chocolate, oblivion, truffle, tort, or any other discard of meditation, how am I going to get far away from that? Well, you develop distance, and there are different ways you can have distance. So here in the outline, it says what distances you from it, but it also can be thought about as like, what is difference from it? So the root verse reads, through different characteristics and through incompatibility, through separate time and place. So there are 4 types of distance. Distance of different characteristics, being incompatible, being in a separate time, and being in a separate place. And this is like the distance between the sources. That means the 4 elements of earth, water, fire, and air. Incompatibility between like discipline or immoral behavior. Different place, it's like the difference between, 2 different locations, like the difference between, say, Nepal and Canada, or different distance of time. Or these days, Nepal and Canada aren't so far as they used to be. Like the difference between Canada and Mars. Okay, that's distance, right? And the distance of time is the difference in particular between the 2 times of past and future. So there are 4 ways of being distant, being far apart through having different characteristics, even within one assemblage. Say for example, you have, chocolate, oblivion, truffle, tort, as long as I'm using it, I'll say it. It's made up of the 4 elements of earth, water, fire, and air. They're all 4 present in it according to this. You've got the 4 elements. These are the 4 elements according to the what do we say? The 4 elements according to the Abhidharma. The 4 elements according to a baker are chocolate, milk fats, sugar, and alcohol. Chocolate, oblivion, truffle, tort has 3 of those 4. At any rate, you could probably make it with a 4th, but I wouldn't do that. At any rate, the 4 elements, you've got earth, water, fire, and air all have separate characteristics, and so they're distant from each other, but they all function together to make that one thing, chocolate, oblivion, truffle, tort, or whatever else. So being far apart through being incompatible with the antidote, this means like the wisdom as opposed to the ignorance, right? So being incompatible with that. So like when you have the wisdom of the path of seeing, that is incompatible with attachment to a realm. Being far apart through separate places, so, Earth and Mars, and being far apart in time or between the past and future. So in order, these are like the distances of the 4 sources or elements, the distance between immorality and discipline, the distance between the 2 regions of East and West, or in the treatise's explanation, the distance between the 2 times of past and future. So those are the 4 different types of distance. Now, the other thing is when you have abandoned something, then you abandon it once. But in the Great Exposition School, there is the quality of attainment. So at the same time as you abandon, so I have abandoned the discards of meditation, and I've attained that. I haven't. I'm using this as, when you attain that, then you also get a separate quality, attainment. Now you abandon the kernels once, but the attainment you get at different times. So it says, they are extinguished once, removal is then attained again and again on birth of ante, attaining the results and refining faculties. So first of all, when the antidote arises, you get the attainment of it. Or when you go from being an ordinary individual to being like a noble individual, a stream enterer, or once returner, non-returner, an arhat, then each of those stages, you've abandoned them, but that the quality is a little bit different, so you get a new attainment. The abandonment isn't itself different, but there's a new attainment, because you, instead of being an ordinary individual who's abandoned, you then become a stream enterer, or whatever. You become a superior individual, and so that's through attaining results. And the last one is through refining faculties. Refining faculties means that even within the levels of stream enterer, non-returner, once returner, non-returner, and arhat, there are different levels, like your garden variety arhat and the Bhagavan Buddha are the same in being arhats, but there's a big difference in faculties between the two of them. In particular, on the path, you've got people who are kind of following faith and people who are following prajna. And so the question is, how can you, they're kind of difference in faculties. So you can refine your faculties. If you're a kind of low faculties, you're not stuck being low faculties. You can change. You can improve and get to a higher level. So that's what we mean by refining faculties. So is the attainment of the removal of abandonment by the previously explained methods of discarding. In other words, when you have abandoned it, you've got that attainment. So is only caused by abandoning the discards with the antidote. So it's the only cause of that attainment, actually discarding the discard? The answer is no. When you do these three things, then you get a new attainment. When the antidote arises, or when you achieve a new result, or when you refine your faculties, you get a new attainment. So it's like when the antidotes have discarded what they abandon, those are extinguished once. So the abandonment arises and it extinguishes once. So that only happens once. You never have to extinguish them again. But the removal is then attained and again, becoming better. So it improves in this way upon the birth of the antidote, the path of liberation. Then you have this, so like this is the second of the four paths, or the third of the four paths, right? You have the training, and then the path of no obstacles that actually eliminates it. And then you have the path of liberation, which is like the next moment. So that's another time that it arises. And then upon attaining the four results of the spiritual way, which mean the results of stream enterer, someone who's seen the Four Noble Truths, once returner, someone who's going to, who will within this lifetime eliminate their attachment to the desire realm, non-returner, someone who is free of attachment to the desire realm, but not to the but not free of attachment to the former formless realm. And then arhat, someone who is free of attachment to all three realms of existence. So those are the results of the spiritual way. Stream enterer, once returner, non-returner, and arhat. Those are discussed in much more length in the next chapter. And upon refining faculties from dull to sharp. So there are 6 instances. So this teaches all the causes for attaining the improved attainments of returnal. So the first time is when the antidote arises. That's the first attainment. And then you've got 4 instances when you increase. So that's the first time that you get the attainment. And the second time is when you achieve stream enter. Third time is achieving once returner. Fourth time is achieving non-returner. Fifth time would be achieving arhat. And the 6th time would be improving your faculties from dull to sharp. So those are the 6. And they don't necessarily have to happen in that order. In fact, you'd probably refine your faculties before you achieve arhatship. It's possible to do it later, but generally done before. So the next section is the last major section of this chapter, the results of discarding the kernels. So this has 5 topics. The classifications of the results, which perfect knowings are the result of what, that is, what type of path, establishing their quantity, and how they're possessed by individuals, and finally, forfeiting and attaining. So today we will only go through the first of these, the classification of the results. The root here reads, 9 perfect knowings in desire Upon exhausting the first two, there's one. Exhausting two, there are two. And likewise, just those three above. What leads to lowest form in the extinction of all defilements, three more perfect knowings. So perfect knowings, this is what we're talking about as the result of eliminating this. Now, when you say the word perfect knowing, it can kind of have two different... Oh, I realized I hadn't been showing the screen. I'm sorry about that. So here it is. I'm meaning to pause the share at a moment. I realized I hadn't been sharing it. So here's the text, 9 perfect knowings in desire. And so here, upon exhausting the first two. So the first thing is there are 9 perfect knowings. Now the word perfect knowing can have either of two meanings. The first meaning they can have is like completely knowing something. In other words, a type of wisdom. So it can mean that wisdom, the wisdom that discards the antidotes, or that discards the wisdom that discards kernels, or of all of a class of kernels. So it can mean that wisdom, but it can also mean the result of that, which is the cessation of the kernels, or the cessation of a particular type of attachment. So here, generally, it's kind of, we're talking, generally this is taught as taught to be about talking about the truth of cessation, and which is thinking about this in terms of this 9 perfect knowing as being the result, which is cessation of the kernels. So what this means is saying that you're calling the cessation by its cause, by the name of its cause, which is perfect knowing. So calling the result by the name of the cause. So in the desire realm, now when we achieve the perfect knowings, we achieve them on the path of seeing and on the path of meditation. So we achieve 6 of them in the path of seeing. So in desire, upon exhausting the first 2, the truth, all of the defilements of these of path and of suffering and origin, then you get 1. And then when you exhausting 2, that would be the final 2 of cessation and path. There are 2. So you've got 2. When you see cessation and truth together, then you got 1. Then you've got your 1 for seeing. When you see suffering and origin, those 2 together, you get 1. When you see cessation, you get 1, and when you see path, you get 1. So you've got 3. Kind of 3 different perfect knowings. That's in the desire realm. And then likewise, just those 3 above. So just as you see it in the desire realm, when you see the truths in the form and formless realm, then you also exhaust when you exhaust the suffering and origin, the formless realm, you get 1. Then you exhaust cessation, you get another. And when you exhaust path, then you get a 3rd. So that's 3 in the higher realm. So 3 in the lower realm, 3 in desire, and 3 in the higher realms. That's 6. Then when you're on the path of meditation, when you achieve freedom from the realm of desire, you get 1. That what leads to lowest, those are the defilements that lead to the lowest, the desire realm, or those defilements that lead to the form, when you are free of attachment to the form realm. And when you achieve the extinction of all defilements, then you get a 3rd. So there are 3 more perfect knowings for a total of 9. Okay? So well then, it says in the commentary, is the abandonment of all discards presented as a single perfect knowing. In other words, you have just one result from abandoning all of these. You've got 98 kernels. So when you get rid of the 98 kernels, is it like just one big result, one big present you get at the end? No. You get the results in stages, and we talk about this in terms of the perfect knowings, is 9. It is not. There are 9 perfect knowings of abandonment. In other words, the abandonment, actually having abandoned all of the each set of related discards is that you get a perfect knowing. So firstly, in the realm of desire, upon exhausting the first 2 discards by seeing, suffering, and origin, there is 1 perfect knowing. So when you And the reason why these two are grouped together is that when you discard suffering, you still have a few of those universal kernels that are still looking at it. And so it's not completely gone yet. But when you've eliminated origin, then all of those universals of the realm of desire are gone, right? So upon exhausting those two, you get one perfect knowing when you've exhausted the suffering of an origin. In the desire realm only, upon exhausting the two discards by seeing cessation and path, there are two perfect knowings, one each for a total of three knowings in desire. So the one of cessation, of suffering and origin combined, one for cessation and one for path, for three in the desire realm. And just as there are three perfect knowings of the abandonments of discards of seeing and desire, likewise there are just those three above in form or formless. The form and formless realm in the path of seeing are the kernels of those realms are discarded simultaneously. The first upon abandoning those discarded by seeing, suffering, and origin. The second upon abandoning those discarded by seeing, cessation. And the third upon abandoning the discards of seeing, the path. So thus the abandonment of the discards of seeing the three realms is seeing the truths, the four noble truths in the three realms is the six perfect knowings, three in desire, three in the form and formless. Then on the path of meditation, and that's kind of where the real work lies, there's one perfect knowing of the abandonment of the discards that lead to the lowest. In other words, when you abandon all of the kernels, all of the afflictions of the desire realm, you've perfectly known it. You've developed all of the wisdom and they've completely been abandoned. So like there's this perfect knowing and that perfect abandonment. It is called by that term, the lowest, because it is the discards that lead to the lowest. It's called by that term because it has extinguished all the defilements of the desire realm. So there's no more defilement that would lead to the lowest. In the abandonment of the defilements of the form realm, there is the perfect knowing of the extinction of desire for form, its primary fetter. So the main thing that keeps, once you have freed yourself from the desire realm and you have in the form realm, then at that point you still have attachment to the form realm, attachment or desire for the form realm. So when that is completely gone, when you have eliminated all attachment, even to the fourth jhana, then there's another perfect knowing because you've abandoned everything in the form realm. And the extinction of all defilements is also just one, the perfect knowing of the elimination of all fetters. This is when you achieve the state of arhat, then you've abandoned all of the afflictions of all three realms, and that's another perfect knowing. So there are these three more perfect knowings on the path of meditation. So for a total, there are these 9 perfect knowings. So the point here is that as you you're going through in stages, and it's like in each stage, there is a moment where you've known it perfectly, you've given up perfectly. The 3 on the path of seeing in the desire realm, the 3 on the path of seeing in the higher realms, then the additional 3 on the path of meditation. Each of these is like marking a stage. In actuality, as we'll talk about it, you kind of get little, each time a discard is overcome, there's a cessation of that discard. So it's like you've got many different levels of cessations, many different levels of achievements. But to kind of group them into a smaller number, we'd say there are these 3 perfect ones where you have completely given up everything within a certain class. So I think that is enough for today. Tomorrow is what? Tomorrow is Monday. And seeing as tomorrow is Monday, tomorrow will be our weekly day off from this class. Also, just to remind you, next week, Saturday, the 26th of June, we will not have class because it is the birthday of the Gyalwang Karmapa. So we will celebrate that with a puja here at the monastery that will start at 8 in the morning and I think be broadcast 8 in the morning Pacific time, basically 2 hours before our class usually happens, if you can figure that out from your time zone. And you are welcome to join us by watching that online, but we will not be able to have a class that morning. This morning we had today's Guru Rinpoche day, and we had the Guru Rinpoche puja, and so it was like a very quick shift for me to go from puja into teaching this morning. So next week we won't have to worry about that. The puja will also be slightly longer than it was this morning. And that is that for now. Do any of you in the Zoom audience have any questions? And as usual, people who are watching on YouTube can send them in by email. If there are no questions, then we will, what do we say? We will recite the dedication prayer. So please think to yourself that we must dedicate the merit of teaching and listening to the Dharma to the benefit of all sentient beings, to free them all from all the sufferings of samsara, bring them to the perfect state of Buddhahood. And so thinking in this way, please recite this dedication prayer. O sanam de tam che se bani tomne nye peranam pam che te Kegana chi ma long cho mai si be to le ro nu ro sho. By this merit may we attain omniscience, defeat the enemy, wrongdoing, and free all beings swiftly from the ocean of existence, churned by great waves of birth, age, sickness, and death. Changchup semcho rinpoche ma ke panam ke gyuruchi ke pa nyamba me pariyang gonne gondu pelwar sho. May bodhicitta, great and precious, arise in those who have not roused it, never weakening in those who have, may it grow ever stronger and stronger. So thank you very much. I hope to see all of you again on Tuesday. So thank you very much.